City Press paper reporting this morning that the Judicial Service Commission has handed over a report on candidates shortlisted for the Chief Justice post, and that report described Justice Raymond Zondo as a judge without a vision for the judiciary. It comes just days before Zondo takes over the role of Chief Justice on a permanent basis after being appointed by President Cyril Ramaphosa. Well, let's get more on the story. We're joined by retired Judge Dennis Davis. Judge Davis, good evening to you. Thank you for your time. This issue of the JSC, it seems like it's going to be a really, really contentious one. Let's speak firstly about what the City Press is reporting on, that inside this report is not just recommendations from the JSC on which judge should be the preferred or is the preferred candidate for Chief Justice, but they also seem to have made some disparaging comments around the Chief Justice designate, Raymond Zondo.
Yes, they did do. Of course, one's got to ask oneself in the first place the context in which these hearings took place and the deliberations were implemented, if I could put it that way, because it's common cause that they were hugely controversial. We now know that key members of the JSC will no longer sit on the JSC. My understanding is that Advocate Mpofu SC has been replaced. My understanding is that the President has now sought to replace Advocate Griffiths Modonsela SC. Now, they were very crucial players. Why do I say that? Because of the way, if one watched the interviews, that they, together with Mr. Malema, made a lot of the running. So the question really arises is, if we were so, as it were, appalled by some of the treatment which was meted out to distinguished judges, including Justice Zondo and Justice Malambo, why are we particularly surprised by the report, or why should we take it particularly seriously?
In speaking to the media for the first time since that announcement was made, Justice Zondo was very generous in his commentary about the kind of relationship that he believes he will have with, members of the JSC, and in fact did not seem to see the way in which the interview process was conducted as having been particularly negative, and really took on the robustness of the day. But do you think there are going to be some challenges, Judge Davis?
Well, firstly, let me say, I suppose that shows that Justice Zondo proves the point that many of us have made, that, he is a leader because he's been able to put that behind him, and rightly so, because he's got to work with the JSC, and he will work with a slightly different JSC, which doubtless will be different to the one which presently constituted. We do not know who the President will appoint to replace Advocate Modonsela. We do know that Advocate Pile SC has been appointed, I think, by AFT to be their representative. She's a very fine lawyer, and it does seem to me that the very environment of the JSC will in fact change considerably. And then, of course, remember this, that Justice Zondo actually chaired the meeting before the hearings for the Chief Justice, and it all seemed to go quite swimmingly. In fact, most people commented that there was a marked change in the atmosphere and the deliberation from what previously been the case, unfortunately, over a series of JSC meetings prior to that. So I have little doubt that that is so. I'm sure that politicians who particularly had a view of Justice Zondo will put it behind them, because after all, the JSC has to do its job, and I think the accountability that the public in general and the media in particular exercised on the JSC in terms of the controversial hearings will be a good thing, because I'm quite certain everybody's going to be on best behavior when the next set of interviews takes place.
One of the concerns that has been raised again by the JSC is the potential litigation that Justice Zondo will find himself at the center of, particularly given what is now, of course, the finalized parts of the state capture inquiry reports that have been made public, of course, as we wait for the final one. As a judge, do you have particular concerns around how he may navigate that space?
Well, he's obviously got to recuse himself from any case that comes before his own court with regard to that. I accept that. But that would have been the case irrespective. In other words, even if he was a Deputy Chief Justice and the State Capture Commission was sought to be reviewed before the Constitutional Court, that would have occurred. It's one of the arguments why a number of people, and thoughtful contributions, have suggested that these kinds of controversial commissions of inquiry should be chaired by retired judges. Having said that, of course, my own personal view is that Justice Zondo has done an extraordinarily brave, principled and thorough job on the Zondo Commission, and of course I didn't think he should be punished for that. But I do accept that obviously whether he was Chief Justice or Deputy Chief Justice, there always is the problem of a sitting judge, as it were, being the subject of litigation, even if it's nominee officio, meaning because he's the chair of the commission and the contents of his report are reviewed. And of course, generally speaking, given the way in which litigation takes place in South Africa with some parties, of course, some of that litigation may contain some less than fulsome remarks about Judge Zondo. But I suspect, as I say, I didn't think that was a sufficient reason why somebody who'd done such a courageous job should be punished for that, if indeed he was deserving of being Chief Justice in the first place.
In terms of looking forward, then, what challenges do you think he's going to have in as far as perhaps bringing in some of the reform to the JSC, at least to the extent that they don't want to find themselves in court again, having to be told to reconduct an interview process because a previous one was simply found to have been unfair?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, and I think that it can be divided into two parts, if I may say so. There's a longer-term part, which I think we need to debate, with whether the composition of the Judicial Service Commission is itself optimum to its objectives. Meaning, I've always thought there were too many people in the JSC. I think there are probably slightly too many politicians on the JSC, and that doesn't mean that I'm suggesting there should be more lawyers. But I can't help feeling that if somewhere like England, where 5 of, I think, 15 members of their commission are people drawn from civil society, why that can't be the case in South Africa as well. Certainly, in my experience, because I was appointed a very long time ago, and as Judge President, I had to go before the Judicial Service Commission many times to appoint judges of the Competition Appeal Court, I was always thunderously impressed by John Ernson, an ex-trade unionist who was on the JSC, and I thought he brought a perspective which was really different and particularly fruitful. So that's the long term. In the shorter term, I think it's about time that the JSC actually teased out the various kind of principles that Chief Justice Mohammed tried to do and others. There's a very excellent document prepared by now Justice Susanna Cowan on the kind of criteria that should be applied. I think the JSC would be well suited if it actually did publish much more careful criteria and calibrated them properly and then used those clearly and definitively in interviews so that you don't have higgledy-piggledy interviews. The problem, for example, in the last set of interviews, which is why, going back to your first question, one can't really take us all that seriously, is because on the one hand, Justice Belambo and to a great extent Justice Zondo had outrageously confrontational interviews, whereas I think it is fair to say that Justice Meyer, no disrespect to her, and it's not her fault, but she had a sweetheart interview. Now that's not right. You've got to give, I don't want people having outrageously rude interviews, but I want everybody having broadly probing the same sets of questions. There are obviously demographic questions, but there are also transformational questions. Those are questions in relation to what your commitment is to transforming our society through the Constitution. And then I think they're record questions about your judicial record, not basically arguing in relation to JSC, why did you find against me, but more principial issues about the judicial philosophy of a judge. Those are the sorts of things we'd love to see the JSC do. And then the interviews become productive, they educate the public, and they allow the Judicial Service Commission to appoint the very, very best people.
When we perhaps look into the future and again the anticipated litigation over the state capture inquiry, it also takes us back to something else that the JSC said they had found around the Chief Justice Designate Raymond Zondo that he lacked discipline. And that seems to suggest that if we go back to his interview, there's a particular way that they feel would be appropriate for a Chief Justice to engage, whether with politicians, whether with the media, and how and what they should be speaking about publicly. But of course, we're living in what is an evolving, social sphere, if I can put it that way. I wonder if you have any specific views on whether these expectations around judges, what they say, what they don't say, how we manage those expectations.
Yes, I think that's a very good question. I don't think we live in a world of the kind of monastic, cloistered situation of the 19th century and the 20th century. I think judges should obviously tread carefully when talking. We should be allowed to defend the Constitution, the values of the Constitution. Obviously, we're entitled to give lectures at universities in relation to legal questions, and in fact, the more judges that do that, the richer the experience for students. I do think, however, that when it comes to the question of engaging with politicians, that's a job for the Chief Justice, nobody else. And that's got to obviously be dealt with carefully. I know that implicit in your question, I suppose, is whether Justice Zondo, as the acting Chief Justice, should have called a press conference dealing with the remarks made by Mrs. Sisulu. Or I suppose you could say the same about the remarks made by Mr. Zikalala. Namely, we shouldn't have a constitution and it's a load of rubbish. Well, there I do think the Chief Justice, as the head of one arm of the state, is entitled to say things. Obviously, in a principial way, defending the institution of the judiciary and defending the constitution of which judges are the custodians. And of course, as we know, Justice Zondo consulted with all the judges present before he made that. That's the sort of thing I think should be done sparingly, not often. You don't want judges in the in the firing line every day. But that issue, which is I think what we're really talking about, is the job of the Chief Justice and nobody else, and it should be done in exceptional circumstances of that kind. Of course, Chief Justice Mogoeng did something which was interesting, having a judicial week or whatever it was, in which he sort of reported to the nation about what the judges do. And that's not a bad idea, which is in a sense to tell the public in an educative way what it is that judges do and why, in fact, what they do is so important and why the Constitution is as important as it is. I've had a particular passion myself, believing that we need constitutional education, that the way we defend our Constitution is the more people know about it, know how central the rights are in that Constitution to the betterment of their society. That's why we can preserve constitutional democracy, and that in a sense is, I think, what we're really talking about.
Retired Judge, President of the Competition Appeal Court and the High Court, Judge Dennis Davis, let me thank you for your time tonight.